The silence in our mother's house was a physical thing. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a heavy blanket, thick with the scent of wilting lilies and old wood polish, muffling every sound. The tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had been the steady heartbeat of my entire life, now seemed unnervingly loud, each swing of its brass pendulum marking a moment that she was no longer here to share. It had been 3 days since the funeral. 3 days of my older brother, Mark, pacing the worn Aubusson carpet, his expensive leather shoes squeaking with each agitated turn, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders about mergers and acquisitions. It had been 3 days of my younger sister, Sophie, drifting from room to room like a ghost, her fingers trailing over dusty photographs, her eyes wide and lost. And it had been 3 days of me, Clara, doing what I always did. I cleaned. I made coffee that no one drank. I answered the door when neighbors brought by casseroles, their faces a mask of practiced sympathy. I was the anchor, the one who had stayed while they had built their lives elsewhere. The air in the living room grew even colder when Mr. Henderson, our mother's lawyer, arrived. The sound of his car crunching on the gravel driveway sent a fresh wave of tension through the room. He was a tall, stooped man, smelling faintly of mothballs and stale paper. The leather of his briefcase groaned as he set it down on the coffee table, the brass latches clicking open with a dreadful finality. Mark immediately ended his call, his face shifting into a mask of solemn importance. Sophie sank into the deep cushions of the armchair, pulling a threadbare afghan around her shoulders, her small frame looking even more fragile. I just stood by the fireplace, my hand resting on the cool marble of the mantelpiece, my knuckles white. "Thank you all for being here," Mr. Henderson began, his voice dry as autumn leaves. He shuffled some papers, the crisp sound filling the quiet room. Eleanor was a very organized woman. She made her wishes quite clear. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I had given up everything for our mother these past 5 years. After her diagnosis, I had moved back home, leaving behind my small apartment and my job as a librarian. I had been her hands, her feet, her memory. I had held her hand through every doctor's appointment, every chemo session. I had read to her at night when the pain kept her awake, my voice growing hoarse as the sun began to tint the sky outside her window. She had always told me, her voice a papery whisper in those final weeks, "You'll be taken care of, Clara. Don't you worry." I clung to those words. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "To my son, Mark, I leave the entirety of my stock portfolio and investment accounts." He listed a series of numbers that made my head spin. I could feel Mark's posture straighten beside me, a small, almost imperceptible puffing of his chest. He was the successful one, the financial advisor. It made a cold kind of sense. "To my daughter, Sophie," the lawyer continued, "I leave my collection of jewelry, including my mother's diamond engagement ring and the pearl necklace I wore on my wedding day." Sophie let out a small, watery gasp, her hand flying to her throat. She had always coveted our mother's jewelry, admiring the way the gems caught the light. Then, Mr. Henderson looked at me. His eyes, behind thick glasses, were flat and devoid of pity. "And to my daughter, Clara, I leave the sum of $25,000 with my deepest gratitude for her care and companionship in my final years." The words hit me like a physical blow. The air rushed from my lungs. $25,000. It was an insult. It was less than a year's salary at the job I had left. It was a pittance, a tip for services rendered. The grandfather clock in the hall seemed to mock me with its steady, indifferent ticking. "And finally," Mr. Henderson said, folding the paper, "the house. The property and all its contents are to be left to my son, Mark, to do with as he sees fit." The room swam. I gripped the mantelpiece to steady myself. The marble felt impossibly cold, leaching the warmth from my fingers. I could hear Mark letting out a slow, controlled breath, the sound of victory. He had always wanted the house. It was a status symbol, a piece of prime real estate in a town where he'd always wanted to be king. He would sell it. He would gut it of our memories and sell it to the highest bidder without a second thought. My home, the place where I had spent the last 5 years of my life, where every creak of the floorboards and every scent in the air was woven into the fabric of my being, was no longer mine. "Well," Mark said, his voice smooth and authoritative, breaking the stunned silence. "That seems clear enough. Thank you, Mr. Henderson." Sophie was crying quietly, her face buried in the afghan. She was probably crying for the loss of our mother, for the finality of it all. But I couldn't cry. A hot, bitter anger was coiling in my stomach, a venom I hadn't known I possessed. I looked at my mother's portrait above the fireplace. Her smile was serene, her eyes kind. How could she? How could she have seen my sacrifice, my devotion, as worth so little? Over the next 2 weeks, the house began to feel like a prison. Mark was there every weekend, striding through the rooms with a clipboard, making notes. The plumbing will need to be completely redone, he'd announced to no one in particular. And this wallpaper is a nightmare. He spoke of the house as if it were a cadaver to be dissected, not the place where we'd grown up, where our heights were marked in pencil on a doorframe in the kitchen. Sophie came once, collected the velvet jewelry boxes, her eyes red-rimmed and averted, and then she was gone, back to her artist's loft 2 states away. I was left to do the real work, the heartbreaking work. I was the one who had to sort through our mother's things. Her closet was the hardest. As I opened the door, a wave of her signature scent, lavender and something warm, like vanilla, washed over me, so potent and real that for a half second I thought she was standing right behind me. My throat closed up. I pulled out her dresses, the soft silks and worn cottons sliding through my fingers. I could remember her in each one. The blue floral dress she wore to my high school graduation. The simple cashmere sweater she always wore when she read in the evenings. I folded each item, my movements slow and reverent, the feel of the fabric a tangible link to her. Her bedroom was exactly as she'd left it, a sanctuary of stillness. The afternoon sun cast a dusty golden beam across the room, illuminating the worn quilt on her bed and the stack of books on her nightstand. She had been a voracious reader. Her collection was her greatest treasure. The shelves lining the walls were crammed with everything from well-loved classics to modern poetry. It was my job to box them up, to decide which to donate and which to keep. The task felt monumental, like dismantling a life 1 page at a time. I started with the top shelf, my hands covered in a fine layer of dust. The smell of old paper and leather bindings filled my nostrils. I ran my fingers over the spines, reading the faded gold lettering. Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, Walt Whitman. Then I saw it, tucked away at the very end of the shelf, almost hidden behind a set of encyclopedias, was a thin volume of Robert Frost's poetry. It was her absolute favorite. The cover was soft, worn leather, the corners rounded from years of use. When I was a little girl and couldn't sleep, she would sit on the edge of my bed and read, stopping by woods on a snowy evening, her voice a low, soothing murmur that always carried me into dreams. I pulled the book from the shelf. It felt wrong, heavier than it should have, and oddly rigid. I held it in my hands, a strange feeling prickling the back of my neck. The weight was uneven, centered in the middle of the book. I let the covers fall open. The first few pages were normal, filled with poems I knew by heart. But then, my fingers brushed against a page that was thick and unyielding. I looked closer. It wasn't a page at all. The middle section of the book had been carefully, meticulously hollowed out, creating a secret compartment. And inside, nestled in the carved-out space, was a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a circle of dark red wax. My mother's initial, E, was pressed into it. My name, Clara, was written on the front in her elegant, looping handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. My heart started to beat a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs, so loud I was sure it could be heard in the silent house. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely work my fingernail under the wax seal. It cracked with a small, sharp sound. Inside was a set of folded papers, stiff with age, and a smaller, single sheet of stationery. I unfolded the smaller sheet first. It was a letter, written in the same familiar script. "My dearest Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means you have found what I was too cowardly to give you in life. Please forgive me. I have arranged for my official will, the one read by Mr. Henderson, to be a performance. I know your brother. I know his pride and his sense of entitlement. I knew that if I divided things equally, he would have made your life a living hell, pressuring you to sell, bullying you until you gave in. And Sophie, my darling, flighty Sophie, would have followed his lead. I had to protect you, and I had to protect this house. This house is your home, Clara. You have earned it 1,000 times over." Tears were blurring the words, hot and fast, dripping onto the page. I wiped them away with the back of my hand, the salty taste of them on my lips. "You have a strength you don't recognize in yourself," the letter continued. "You have a spine of steel, my love. You just forget it's there sometimes. You will need it now. What you found with this letter is my true last will and testament. It is signed, it is witnessed, it is legal. Mr. Henderson knows nothing of it. I used a different lawyer in the next town over, a woman my age who understood. Her name and number are on the document. The house and everything in it is yours. There is also a trust account set up in your name. Enough so you will never have to worry. I did this not as payment, but as a recognition of your love. You gave me the greatest gift a mother could ask for. You gave me your time, your heart, your life. You stayed. Everyone else left, but you stayed. This house needs a heart, and you have always been its heart. Don't let them take it from you. Be strong. All my love, Mom. I sank down onto the floor, the letter clutched in my hand, my body shaking with silent, racking sobs. The other document, the will itself, lay on the carpet beside me. It was all there in stark, legal language, witnessed by two names I didn't recognize. It was dated just 6 months ago. She hadn't forgotten me. She hadn't betrayed me. She had been trying to protect me. The anger that had been simmering inside me for weeks dissolved, replaced by a wave of grief so profound it stole my breath. But it was a different kind of grief now. One laced with a fierce, burning love and a new, terrifying resolve. My mother had just handed me a declaration of war. And for the first time in my life, I felt ready to fight. The confrontation came on a Saturday. The air was thick and humid, the kind of late summer day that promises a thunderstorm. The sky outside the living room window was a bruised, heavy gray. Mark was there, of course. He'd brought color swatches and was holding them up against the walls, his brow furrowed in concentration. A neutral grayish, I think, he said, mostly to himself. It will appeal to a wider market. Sophie was there too, a rare appearance. She'd come to pick up a few last things, she'd said. She sat curled on the sofa, looking small and miserable, picking at a loose thread on a cushion. The tension between the three of us was a living entity in the room, a fourth presence that sucked all the oxygen from the air. The only sound was the incessant ticking of the grandfather clock and the rustle of Mark's paint samples. I had spent the last 2 days rehearsing this moment in my head. I had called the lawyer my mother had named, a woman named Mrs. Gable, whose voice was warm and firm. She had confirmed everything. The will was ironclad. She had advised me on what to do, what to say. But now, with my siblings in front of me, the words felt stuck in my throat, a lump of pure fear. Mark, I began, my voice a weak croak. I cleared my throat and tried again, forcing strength into my tone. Mark, we need to talk. He didn't even look at me. In a minute, Clara. I'm trying to decide between Pebble Path and Urban Mist. The casual dismissiveness was the final spark on the kindling of my anger. No, now, I said, my voice ringing out with a clarity that surprised even me. It silenced the room. Mark slowly lowered the color swatches, turning to look at me with an expression of mild annoyance. Sophie's head snapped up, her eyes wide. I walked over to the coffee table and placed the worn poetry book on its polished surface. Then, I laid the envelope and the 2 documents beside it. My hands were steady. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by my mother's words echoing in my mind. You have a spine of steel. What's this? Mark asked, his tone laced with impatience. More of Mom's old junk? We're trying to declutter, Clara, not make more of a mess. This, I said, tapping the official-looking document, is our mother's real will. For a moment, there was complete silence, broken only by a distant roll of thunder. Then, Mark let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a horrible sound, full of derision. Oh, that's rich. Her real will. What did you do? Type it up yourself last night. I know you're upset, Clara, but this is pathetic. It's not a fake, I said, my voice low and even. It was hidden in this book. It was drafted by a different lawyer 6 months ago. It's signed and witnessed. And it says something very different from the document Mr. Henderson read. Sophie was now on the edge of her seat, her gaze flicking between me and the papers on the table. Clara, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that Mom left the house to me, I said, looking directly at Mark. His smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She left the house, and a trust to maintain it, to me. She knew you'd sell it, Mark. She knew you didn't care about this place, only what it was worth. His face hardened, the condescending amusement replaced by a cold fury. He stepped forward and snatched the will from the table. His eyes scanned the page, his lips a thin, white line. This is garbage, he hissed, the paper crinkling in his tightening fist. This is a forgery. You're insane. You were her nurse, Clara, that's all. She pitied you. You think she would leave her most valuable asset to you? The one who never made anything of herself. Each word was a poisoned dart, finding its mark. The old insecurities, the familiar feeling of being the lesser sibling, rushed back in. But then I saw my mother's letter, still lying on the table. Her words were my shield. She also left this, I said, my voice shaking slightly but holding firm. I picked up the letter. She left a letter. For me. But I think you both need to hear it. I'm not listening to any more of this nonsense, Mark spat, turning away. You will listen, I said, and the command in my voice made him stop. Sophie was staring at me, her face pale, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone from the coming storm. I began to read. I read my mother's words about Mark's pride and Sophie's tendency to be swayed. I read her words about protecting the house. My voice cracked when I got to the part about my sacrifice, about me being the heart of the home, about how I had stayed. I could feel my brother's rage radiating across the room, a palpable heat. I could feel my sister's conflict, her confusion. When I read the final lines, "Don't let them take it from you. Be strong," a loud clap of thunder rattled the windows in their frames, as if the sky itself was punctuating her final command. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime, its deep, resonant bells marking the hour, each one a toll for the family we had once been. Silence descended again, thick and suffocating. Mark stood with his back to me, his shoulders rigid. Sophie was openly weeping now, her face in her hands. Finally, Mark turned around. His face was a thundercloud of fury. "So that's your game," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You found some sentimental note she wrote when she was high on morphine, and you've cooked up this fantasy. You're going to regret this, Clara. I'm calling my lawyer. I will drag you through a court battle so ugly you'll wish you'd never been born. This house is mine, and I will see you on the street before I let you steal it from me." He stormed out of the room, the front door slamming behind him with a force that shook the whole house. A moment later, we heard the sound of his car tires squealing on the asphalt as he sped away. The rain began to fall then, a soft patter at first, then a torrential downpour, lashing against the windows. Sophie and I were left alone in the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of our mother's words and my brother's threats. Sophie looked up at me, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking mix of confusion, guilt, and sorrow. "Did she really write that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "About me following Mark?" I simply nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I pushed the letter across the coffee table towards her. She picked it up with a trembling hand and read it for herself. I watched as her expression crumpled, as the truth of our mother's assessment settled into her bones. We sat there for a long time, the only sounds the rain on the roof and the steady, relentless ticking of the clock. The family I had known was broken. But in the wreckage, for the very first time, I felt the foundations of my own life, solid and unshakable, beneath my feet. The weeks that followed were a blur of strained silence and hostile correspondence. Mark made good on his threat. I received a letter from his lawyer, a crisp, intimidating document full of legal jargon that essentially called me a liar and a thief. It demanded I vacate the premises immediately or face legal action. My own lawyer, Mrs. Gable, was my rock. "Don't you worry, dear," she'd said over the phone, her voice a calming balm against my frayed nerves. A handwritten, notarized letter of intent, accompanying a formally witnessed will, is a powerful thing. He's bluffing. He's trying to scare you. But it was scary. The house, my sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Every creak of the floorboards at night made me jump. Every time the phone rang, my stomach twisted into a knot, expecting it to be Mark, ready to spew more venom. He had cut me off completely. He didn't answer my calls or texts. Sophie was a ghost. She had left that day after the confrontation, murmuring a vague, tearful apology, and had retreated back into her own world. I was truly alone, rattling around in the big, quiet house, the weight of my mother's last wish pressing down on me. One evening, about a month after the fight, I was in the kitchen, trying to force down some toast. The house felt especially empty. The rain was drumming a soft, hypnotic rhythm on the roof. Suddenly, a car's headlights swept across the kitchen window, and I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. My heart leaped into my throat. It was too late for a delivery. It had to be Mark. I froze, my hand holding the piece of toast halfway to my mouth, my mind racing through what I would say, how I would stand my ground. I heard a car door shut, followed by soft footsteps on the porch. Then a hesitant knock, so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. It wasn't Mark's knock. His was always an impatient, commanding rap. This was tentative. I slowly walked to the door, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. I peered through the peephole, and my breath hitched. It was Sophie. She was standing on the porch, drenched, her thin jacket soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. She was hugging herself, shivering, looking small and lost under the dim yellow light of the porch lamp. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The cool, damp air, smelling of rain and wet earth, rushed in. She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. Can I come in?" she asked, her voice trembling. I stepped back without a word and held the door open for her. She scurried inside, dripping onto the entryway rug. I closed the door, shutting out the storm, and a heavy silence fell between us. "You're soaked," I said finally, my voice sounding rusty. "Let me get you a towel." I fetched a thick, dry towel from the linen closet and a dry sweatshirt of our mother's that I hadn't been able to part with. Sophie took them with a mumbled thanks and disappeared into the downstairs bathroom. While she was gone, I put the kettle on, the familiar whistle a comforting sound in the quiet house. I made 2 mugs of chamomile tea, the steam warming my cold hands. When she came back, she was wrapped in the towel, wearing Mom's old, oversized sweatshirt. She looked like a child again. She curled up in the armchair by the fireplace, the one our mother had always favored, and cradled the warm mug in her hands. We sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the rain. "He's been calling me," Sophie said at last, her voice low. "Mark. He calls every day. He wants me to sign an affidavit, to say that Mom was confused, not of sound mind, to say that you took advantage of her." The hot tea sloshed in my mug as my hand jerked. "And what did you say?" I asked, my voice tight. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She stared into her mug. I told him I needed to think. He makes it all sound so logical, you know. He talks about protecting the family assets. He says you're being emotional and irrational. And you believe him? The words were sharper than I intended. She finally looked at me, her eyes swimming with tears. "No," she whispered. "That's the thing. I don't. Not really. I keep thinking about that letter. Mom knew me. She knew I'd get swept up in his arguments. She knew I'd be afraid to stand up to him. She was right." A single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. "I'm so sorry, Clara. I should have stood by you. I was just scared. He's so loud, and you were so quiet, and I just ran." "I was always the quiet one," I said, a sad smile touching my lips. "It was my job." "No, it wasn't," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "It was just easier for all of us to let it be. Me off chasing my art. Mark off chasing money. And you were here. We took you for granted. Mom saw it. She was the only one who really saw it." She reached into the pocket of her wet jeans and pulled out a folded, slightly damp piece of paper. She slid it across the table to me. It was the affidavit from Mark's lawyer. Across the bottom, in Sophie's messy, artistic script, were 2 words. "I refuse." I looked at her, a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy washing over me. "Sophie, I'm not signing it," she said firmly. "I'm going to call Mark tomorrow and tell him that if he takes you to court, I'll testify on your behalf. I'll read Mom's letter to the judge myself if I have to." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the tightness in my chest eased. I wasn't alone anymore. The house, which had felt like a fortress I had to defend by myself, suddenly felt like a home again. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. Her skin was cold, but I held on, sharing my warmth. We stayed like that for a long time, 2 sisters adrift in a storm, finally finding a port in each other. Mark's legal threats evaporated after that. A final, blustering letter arrived, full of empty pronouncements, and then silence. He had lost his key witness, his leverage. Without Sophie, his case was nothing but a bitter son's tantrum. He had no choice but to retreat. Months passed. The seasons turned. The heavy, humid air of summer gave way to the crisp, cool breezes of autumn. The maple tree in the front yard turned a brilliant, fiery crimson, its leaves blanketing the lawn. Sophie and I began the slow, careful work of rebuilding our relationship. She would drive down every few weekends. We didn't talk about Mark much. The wound was too raw. Instead, we talked about Mom. We shared stories, we laughed, we cried. We went through old photo albums, the crinkle of the plastic pages a soundtrack to our rediscovered sisterhood. We were healing, slowly, piece by piece. One cool November evening, I was alone in the house. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warm orange light dancing on the walls, casting long, friendly shadows. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a peaceful silence, a contented silence. It was the sound of home. I stood before the grandfather clock in the hall. Its steady, rhythmic ticking no longer sounded like a countdown or a mockery. It was just a heartbeat, the heartbeat of the house. My house. I ran my hand down its side, The polished wood smooth and cool beneath my palm. It smelled of lemon oil and thyme. In its reflection, I saw a woman I almost didn't recognize. She looked tired, yes, but her shoulders were straight. Her eyes were clear. There was a strength in her face that hadn't been there before. My mother had been right. The spine of steel had been there all along. It had just been waiting for a reason to straighten up. I had not just inherited a house. I had inherited myself. I had found my voice in the echoes of her silence, my strength in her last, secret wish. And as the clock chimed 10, its deep, sonorous bells filling the warm, quiet air, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was finally truly home.